My name is Bernard Whitcomb. I'm 72 years old, and 6 weeks after my daughter-in-law mocked my modest house in front of her own parents at Christmas dinner, suggesting I should sell it for something a little less embarrassing, I sat across a conference table from my financial advisor, my son, and my daughter-in-law, watching her face change completely as she learned that the modest house she'd mocked sat on a foundation of exactly zero debt, alongside an investment portfolio worth $3,800,000. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway. If you've ever had your modest, careful life mocked by someone who assumed modest meant struggling, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened in that conference room. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 39 years teaching high school mathematics, unglamorous, steady work that never made me wealthy in any obvious way, work that let me raise my son Thomas in the same modest 3-bedroom house I still live in today, purchased 44 years ago with a mortgage my late wife Patricia and I paid off entirely within 18 years, through careful, disciplined budgeting. Patricia passed 9 years ago, and since then I've lived alone in that same house, keeping the furniture mostly as it was when she was still here, not out of any inability to update it, but because those rooms still carry her presence in a way I've never felt any urgency to disturb. Here's the thing about me that Thomas has always known in a general sense, without ever fully appreciating the actual scope of it. Throughout my entire teaching career, Patricia and I lived deliberately below our means, driving modest cars well past when most people would have replaced them, taking simple vacations rather than elaborate ones, and directing the difference, consistently and patiently, into a diversified investment portfolio I began building in my late 20s, and never once stopped contributing to, even during years when doing so required genuine sacrifice. That portfolio, compounding quietly across 4 decades of consistent contributions and disciplined market patience, had grown, by the time of the Christmas dinner this story centers on, to just over $3,800,000. A fact known to almost nobody outside my financial advisor and, in general terms, my son Thomas, though even Thomas had never seen the actual current figures, having simply absorbed, over the years, a vague understanding that his parents had saved responsibly, without any specific sense of the scale involved. Thomas married a woman named Vanessa about 6 years ago, a genuinely accomplished woman who works in commercial real estate, a career that has given her, understandably, a particular professional lens through which she tends to evaluate property and living circumstances. From our very first extended interactions, I noticed Vanessa's assessments of my modest house carried a certain undertone, not overtly rude exactly, but consistently framed around what the property could be worth, if properly updated, or how much easier my life might be in something more manageable. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Vanessa is fundamentally a cruel person. But over 6 years of marriage to Thomas, I noticed a specific pattern developing in how she discussed my living circumstances. A pattern that eventually culminated in the exact comment that set everything else in motion. There was a Thanksgiving, about 3 years ago, when Vanessa mentioned, examining my kitchen with visible professional assessment, that the space really needed updating. This counter layout is honestly costing you resale value every year you wait. A comment delivered with genuine real estate expertise, but that carried, underneath the professional framing, a certain implicit judgment about my apparent unwillingness or inability to address it. There was a summer visit, the following year, when Vanessa's own parents joined us for a barbecue, and I overheard her, through the kitchen window, explaining to her mother, somewhat apologetically, that Thomas's dad's house is a little rough around the edges. I keep telling him he should really consider downsizing into something more updated, but he's stubborn about it. A description that positioned my choice to remain in a paid-off house full of memories as stubbornness, rather than a deliberate, considered decision. There was a dinner party, about a year later, where Vanessa mentioned to several of her real estate colleagues, within my hearing, that her father-in-law lives in this cute little time capsule of a house, hasn't touched the decor since probably the Reagan administration, It's honestly a little sad how he just doesn't seem to prioritize his own living situation." Her colleagues laughed politely, and I stood near the drink table, saying nothing, absorbing another small addition to a pattern I'd been quietly tracking for longer than Vanessa likely realized. There was an afternoon, about 7 months ago, when I overheard Vanessa on the phone with a friend, through the thin walls during a visit, describing my house as, "Honestly kind of sad, this dated little place. I think Bernard's just scraping by on his teacher's pension and doesn't want to admit it, which is heartbreaking in its own way." I stood in my own kitchen for a good 10 seconds, listening to my daughter-in-law describe 44 years of paid-off, deliberate financial discipline as scraping by, and then I continued preparing dinner, saying nothing about what I'd heard. She never knew I'd heard a word. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Vanessa in the way people are angry at strangers. Vanessa had built her own professional identity around real estate value and property presentation, and I think, understandably enough given her career, she'd absorbed a habit of evaluating my living circumstances through that same professional lens, without ever actually asking real questions about whether my modest house reflected financial hardship or simply a deliberate, entirely different set of priorities. The specific comment that set everything in motion happened at Christmas dinner, hosted at my house, as it had been for decades, with Vanessa's own parents joining us for the first time at that particular gathering, a detail that I think mattered considerably to what happened next, given the specific audience Vanessa found herself wanting to impress. Partway through the meal, Vanessa's mother made a polite comment about the house's cozy, lived-in character, and Vanessa, perhaps embarrassed by the modest surroundings in front of her own parents, responded with a laugh that carried more edge than I think she fully intended. "Cozy is one word for it. Honestly, Bernard, I keep telling Thomas we should help you find something a little less embarrassing, somewhere that doesn't look quite so stuck in 1985. No offense, but this house isn't exactly doing you any favors." The table went quiet for a moment, Vanessa's parents exchanging a slightly uncomfortable glance, Thomas visibly uncertain how to respond to his wife's comment about his own childhood home. I want to be honest about what that specific phrase, less embarrassing, did to me, sitting at the head of a table in the house where I'd raised my son, where Patricia and I had built an entire deliberate financial life together, being told, in front of new in-laws, that the house itself was somehow doing me a disservice. I didn't correct her in the moment. I made a mild, deflecting comment about how the house suited me fine, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But something in me, sitting at that table, quietly hardened in a way I didn't fully examine until everyone had left, and I was sitting alone in my own kitchen that evening. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something. Watching at home right now, have you ever had your deliberate, careful choices mocked by someone who assumed modest circumstances automatically meant financial struggle? How did you carry that assumption, knowing the actual truth but choosing not to correct the record in the moment? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 6 weeks later is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. 6 weeks after that Christmas dinner, Thomas called, asking if I'd be willing to meet with him and Vanessa to discuss some financial planning matters, mentioning that Vanessa had suggested involving my financial advisor in the conversation to make sure everything was handled properly. I agreed, genuinely uncertain what the specific conversation might involve, though I suspected, given the timing, that it likely connected to ongoing discussions about my living situation. I want to describe what happened in that conference room exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment everything changed, and it happened almost entirely because Vanessa had, without fully realizing it, set the stage for her own recalibration. My financial advisor, a careful, precise woman named Diane Kessler, who has managed my portfolio for nearly 2 decades, began the meeting by asking what specific topics Thomas and Vanessa wanted to discuss, and Vanessa, taking the lead, explained that she and Thomas had been discussing, with genuine concern, whether I might benefit from downsizing my living situation, perhaps moving into something smaller and more manageable, potentially freeing up equity from the house sale to supplement what she assumed was a modest teacher's pension that might not be adequately supporting my long-term needs. "We just want to make sure Dad's actually financially secure," Vanessa said, her tone genuinely concerned rather than dismissive in that particular moment. "And honestly, that house has so much deferred maintenance at this point. I think selling it and moving into something more manageable could actually free up meaningful resources for his retirement." Diane, who had of course managed my full financial picture for years, glanced at me with a subtle, questioning expression, silently asking whether I wanted her to proceed with the actual numbers or redirect the conversation elsewhere. "Diane," I said, "why don't you walk everyone through the current portfolio summary? I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because it's the actual heart of this story, more than the Christmas comment or the meeting's original premise." Diane pulled up a detailed portfolio summary on the conference room's shared screen, walking through, in her characteristically precise manner, the current total value of my investment accounts, the specific asset allocation I'd maintained across 4 decades of consistent contributions, and the genuinely comfortable, sustainable income the portfolio could support indefinitely, entirely separate from any equity that might eventually come from the house. "Total portfolio value currently sits at just over $3,800,000, Diane said, with the house itself, fully paid off, representing additional, entirely separate equity beyond that figure. Bernard's actual financial position is, frankly, considerably stronger than the vast majority of my clients, teacher's pension or otherwise." I watched Vanessa's face go through several rapid transformations: confusion, then a dawning, disbelieving recognition, then something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine shock as the actual numbers settled into place against the assumptions she'd apparently carried for years. $3,800,000, she repeated slowly. "Bernard, I had no idea. I've been telling people you were scraping by on a teacher's pension. At Christmas, I said your house was embarrassing, that we should help you find something less embarrassing, because I genuinely thought you couldn't afford to maintain it properly." "The house isn't a financial necessity, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice level but not softening the moment either. "It's a choice, one Patricia and I made deliberately, together, decades ago, to live modestly and direct the difference toward exactly the kind of long-term security you're only now learning actually exists." Thomas, sitting beside his wife, had gone very quiet, working through his own version of the same recalibration. "Dad," he said, "why didn't you ever tell us the actual numbers? I knew you'd saved responsibly, but I had no idea it was anywhere close to this scale." "Because your mother and I agreed, a long time ago, that we didn't want you measuring your own life against an inherited number, or feeling pressured to match some standard we'd built for ourselves," I said. "We wanted you to build your own financial life on your own terms, without either leaning on an assumed inheritance or feeling embarrassed by parents who lived modestly by genuine choice rather than necessity." The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where that conference room is the climax, and everything after is a footnote. But that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Vanessa calling me directly, about a week later, asking if she could come by alone, sitting at my actual kitchen table with genuine discomfort on her face. "I've been sitting with what I said at Christmas," she admitted that afternoon, "in front of my own parents, no less. I built an entire assessment of your financial situation based on the surface details of an unremodeled kitchen and a house that hasn't been updated in decades, and I never once considered that those details might reflect a deliberate choice rather than a financial limitation." "Most people don't think to ask that question," I said. "That's not a criticism specific to you. Modest surroundings get assumed to reflect modest means, when sometimes they reflect exactly the opposite. A genuine, deliberate discipline that most people who spend freely never quite manage to develop themselves." "That's generous of you to say," she said. "I don't think I've earned that generosity yet, given what I said in front of my own parents at your own table." There was an afternoon, about a month after that conference room meeting, when Vanessa asked if she could actually understand the investment approach I'd maintained over 4 decades, not the summary figure, but the actual discipline and specific decisions that had built it. I spent an afternoon walking her through the approach, the deliberate below-means living, the consistent contributions maintained even during difficult years, the patient, unglamorous discipline that had actually built the portfolio, one modest decision at a time. I think I assumed building real wealth required visible, obvious markers, an updated house, a newer car, the kind of surface presentation I work with professionally every day, she said, sitting in my kitchen, looking around at the same modest room she'd once described as embarrassing. I never considered that real financial security could look exactly like this. Instead, quiet and unremarkable, and completely invisible unless someone actually bothered to ask. I watched Vanessa, in the weeks after that, do something I hadn't fully seen her do before. At a subsequent family gathering, when a relative made an offhand comment about my house needing updating, Vanessa said, without hesitation, "Bernard's house reflects a deliberate financial discipline that's given him a portfolio worth nearly $4 million. I said something genuinely embarrassing about it at Christmas, and it's honestly one of the things I regret most from this past year. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for years. I thought about Patricia a great deal in those weeks, wondering what she would have made of watching our daughter-in-law finally reckon with an assumption she'd carried, largely unexamined, right up until a financial planning meeting forced the reckoning into the open. It's been almost a year now since that Christmas dinner. Vanessa comes by regularly now, genuine visits rather than the careful, managed politeness that characterized much of our relationship in the years before that conference room meeting. She stopped, entirely, the specific habit of evaluating my living circumstances through a professional real estate lens, and I've noticed her, on more than one occasion, actively defending my choice to remain in the house when others make similar comments about updating or downsizing. Last month, Vanessa asked if I'd be willing to walk her and Thomas through some of my own investment philosophy, not asking for capital, but genuinely wanting to understand the discipline I'd maintained over 4 decades, wanting, she said, to build something similar for their own future rather than continuing to assume that kind of security required visible, expensive markers along the way. I think about that Christmas comment often now, sitting in my own kitchen some evenings, genuinely content with the modest, deliberate life Patricia and I built together in this exact house. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding anything deliberately, but because we've already decided, based on a handful of visible surface details, exactly what shape someone's actual circumstances are allowed to take. Vanessa looked at my house for years and saw an outdated property reflecting financial limitation. She wasn't entirely wrong that the house is genuinely modest and unremarkable to look at. She was wrong about nearly everything else. I don't regret the years of keeping the portfolio's actual scope quiet, deliberately separate from Vanessa's developing assumptions about my financial circumstances. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let the embarrassing comment stand, even briefly, without immediately correcting it myself. I'd make the same choice again, in most respects, wanting Thomas and Vanessa to build their own financial life without measuring themselves against a number they hadn't earned themselves. What I've learned, watching Vanessa genuinely reckon with the gap between her assumption and the actual reality, is that sometimes the people we love need direct, undeniable evidence before an abstract, unspoken truth about who we actually are finally has room to land, evidence that arrives, sometimes, through circumstances neither of us could have planned or predicted. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone mocked your modest, deliberate choices, assuming struggle where there was actually discipline, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe every quiet, unassuming life deserves to be seen for what it actually reflects, not just what it appears to reflect on the surface. Hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you every single week.